The King of Elfland's Daughter by Lord Dunsay. Part 2. Chapter 3. The magical sword meets some of the swords of Elfland. When Alveric came to the enchanted wood, the light in which Elfland glowed had neither grown nor dwindled, and he saw that it came from no radiance that shines on the fields we know, unless the wandering lights of wonderful moments that sometimes astonish our fields, and are gone the instant they come, are strayed over the borders of Elfland by some momentary disorder of magic. Neither sun nor moon made the light of that enchanted day. A line of pine trees up which ivy climbed as high as their lowering black foliage stood like sentinels at the edge of the wood. The silver spires were shining as though it were they that made all this azure glow in which Elfland swam. And Alveric, having by now come far into Elfland, and being now before its capital palace, and knowing that Elfland guarded its mysteries well, drew his father's sword before he entered the wood. The other still hung on his back, slung in its new scabbard over his left shoulder. And the moment he passed by one of those guardian pine trees, the ivy that lived on it unfastened its tendrils and, rapidly letting itself down, came straight for Alveric and clutched at his throat. The long, thin sword of his father was just in time. Had it not been drawn, he would have scarcely got it out, so swift was the rush of the ivy. He cut tendril after tendril that grasped his limbs as ivy grasps old towers, and still more tendrils came for him, until he severed its main stem between him and the tree. And as he was doing this, he heard a hissing rush behind him, and another had come down from another tree and was rushing at him with all its leaves spread out. The green thing looked wild and angry as it gripped his left shoulder, as though it would hold it forever, but Alveric severed those tendrils with a blow of his sword, and then fought with the rest, while the first one was still alive, but now too short to reach him, and was lashing its branches angrily on the ground. And soon, as the surprise of the attack was over, and he had freed himself of the tendrils that had gripped him, Alveric stepped back till the ivy could not reach him, and he could still fight it with his long sword. The ivy crawled back then to lure Alveric on, and sprang at him when he followed it. But, terrible though the grip of ivy is, that was a good sharp sword, and very soon Alveric, all bruised though he was, had so lopped his assailant that it fled back up its tree. Then he stepped back and looked at the wood in the light of his new experience, choosing a way through. He saw at once that in the barrier of pine trees, the two in front of him had had their ivy so shortened in the fight that if he went midway between the two, the ivy of neither would be able to reach him. He then stepped forward, but the moment he did so, he noticed one of the pine trees move closer to the other. He knew then that the time was come to draw his magical sword. So he returned his father's sword to the scabbard by his side, and drew out the other over his shoulder, and going straight up to the tree that had moved, swept at the ivy as it sprang at him, and the ivy fell all at once to the ground, not lifeless, but a heap of common ivory. And then he gave one blow to the trunk of the tree, and a chip flew out, no larger than a common sword would have made, but the whole tree shuddered, and with that shudder disappeared at once a certain ominous look that the pine had had, and it stood there an ordinary unenchanted tree. Then he stepped on through the wood with his sword drawn. He had not gone many paces when he heard behind him a sound like a faint breeze in the tree-tops, yet no wind was blowing in all that wood at all. He looked around, therefore, and saw that the pine trees were following him. They were coming slowly after him, keeping well out of the way of his sword, but to left and right they were gaining on him, so that he saw he was being gradually shut in by a crescent that grew thicker and thicker as it crowded amongst the trees that it met on the way, and would soon crush him to death. Alveric saw at once that to turn back would be fatal, and decided to push right on, relying chiefly on speed, for his quick perception had already noticed something slow about the magic that swayed the wood, as though whoever controlled it were old or weary of magic, or interrupted by other things. So he went straight ahead, hitting every tree in his way, whether enchanted or not. A blow with his magical sword, and the runes that ran in that metal from the other side of the sun was stronger than any spells that there were in the wood. Great oak trees with sinister boles drooped and lost all their enchantment as Alveric flashed past them with a flick of that magical sword. He was marching faster than the clumsy pines, and soon he left in that weird and eerie wood a wake of trees that were wholly unenchanted, that stood there now without a hint of romance or mystery even. And all of a sudden he came from the gloom of the wood to the emerald glory of the Elf King's lawns. Again, we have hints of such things here. Imagine lawns of ours just emerging from night, flashing early lights from their dewdrops when all the stars have gone, bordered with flowers that are just beginning to appear, their gentle colours all coming back after night, untrodden by any feet except the tiniest and wildest, shut off from the wind and the world by trees in whose fronds is still darkness. Picture these waiting for the birds to sing. There is almost a hint there sometimes of the glow of the lawns of Elfland, but then it passes so quickly that we can never be sure. More beautiful than aught our wonder guesses, more than our hearts have hoped, were the dewdrop lights and the twilights in which these lawns glowed and shone. And we have another thing by which to hint of them. Those seaweeds or sea mosses that drape Mediterranean rocks and shine out of blue-green waters for gazers from dizzy cliffs. More like sea floors were these lawns than any land of ours. The air of Elfland is thus deep and blue. At the beauty of these lawns, Alveric stood gazing as they shone through twilight and dew, surrounded by the mauve and ruddy glory of the massed flowers of Elfland, besides which our sunsets pale and our orchids droop, and beyond them lay like night the magical wood, and jutting from that wood with glittering portals of open wide to the lawn, with windows more blue than our sky on summer's nights, as though built of starlight, shone that palace that may be only told of in song. As Alveric stood there with his sword in his hand at the wood's edge, scarcely breathing, with his eyes looking over the lawns at the chiefest glory of Elfland, through one of the portals alone came the king of Elfland's daughter. She walked dazzling to the lawns without seeing Alveric. Her feet brushed through the dew and the heavy air, and gently pressed for an instant the emerald grass, which bent and rose, as our harebells when blue butterflies light and leave them, roaming carefree along the hills of chalk. And as she passed, he neither breathed nor moved, nor could have moved if those pines had still pursued him, but they stayed in the forest, not daring to touch those lawns. She wore a crown that seemed to be carved of great pale sapphires. She shone on those lawns and gardens like a dawn coming unaware out of long night on some planet nearer than us to the sun. And as she passed near Alveric, she suddenly turned her head, and her eyes opened a little in wonder. She had never before seen a man from the fields we know. And Alveric gazed in her eyes, all speechless and powerless still. It was indeed the Princess Lyrazel in her beauty, and then he saw that her crown was not of sapphires but ice. "Who are you?" she said, and her voice had the music that of earthly things, was most like ice in thousands of broken pieces, rocked by a wind of spring upon lakes in some northern country. And he said, I come from the fields that are mapped and known." And then she sighed for a moment for those fields, for she had heard how life beautifully passes there, and how there are always in those fields young generations, and she thought of the changing seasons and children and age of which elfin minstrels had sung when they told of earth. And when he saw her sigh for the fields, we know he told her something of that land whence he had come. And she questioned him further, and soon he was telling her tales of his home and the Vale of Earl, and she wondered to hear of it, and asked him many questions more. And then he told her all he knew of Earth, not presuming to tell Earth's story from what his own eyes had seen in his bare score of years, but telling those tales and fables of the way of beasts and men that the folk of Earl had drawn out of the ages, and which the elders told by the fire at evening, when children asked of what happened long ago. Thus, on the edge of those lawns, whose miraculous glory was framed by flowers we have never known, with the magical wood behind them, and that palace shining near which may only be told of in song, they spoke of the simple wisdom of old men and old women, telling of harvests and the blossoming of roses and May, of which and when to plant in gardens, of what wild animals knew, how to heal, how to sow, how to thatch, and of which the winds in what seasons blew over the fields we knew. And then there appeared those knights who guard that palace, lest any should come through the enchanted wood. 4 of them came shining over the lawns in armour, their faces not to be seen, but all the enchanted centuries of their lives they had not dared to dream of the princess. They had never bared their faces when they knelt armed before her, yet they had sworn an oath of dreadful words that no man else should ever speak with her. If one should come through the enchanted wood with this oath, that now on their lips they marched towards Elfric. Larazel looked at them sorrowfully, yet could not halt them, for they came by command of her father, which she could not avert, and well she knew that her father might not recall his command, for he had uttered it ages ago at the bidding of fate. Alveric looked at their armour, which seemed to be brighter than any metal of ours, as though it came from one of those buttresses near, which are only told of in song. Then he went towards them, drawing his father's sword, for he thought to drive its slender point through some joint of the armour. The other he put into his left hand. As the first knight struck, Alveric parried and stopped the blow, but there came a shock like lightning into his arm, and the sword flew from his hand, and he knew that no earthly sword could meet the weapons of Elfland, and took the magical sword in his right hand. With this he parried the strokes of the Princess Lyrazel's guard, for such these 4 knights were, having waited for this occasion through all the ages of Elfland, and no more shock came to him from any of those swords, but only a vibration in his own sword metal that passed through it like a song, and a kind of glow that arose in it, reaching to Alveric's heart and cheering it. But as Alveric continued to parry the swift blows of the guards, that sword that was kin to the lightning grew weary of these defences, for it has in its essence speed and desperate journeys, and, lifting Alveric's hand along with it, it swept blows at the elvish knights, and the armour of Elfland could not hold it out. Thick and curious blood began to pour through the rifts in the armour, and soon of that glittering company 2 were fallen. And Alveric, encouraged by the zeal of his sword, fought cheerily and soon overthrew another, so that only he and one of the guards remained, who seemed to have some stronger magic about him than had been given to his fallen comrades. And so it was, for when the Elf King had first enchanted the guard, he had charmed this elvish soldier first of all, while all the wonder of his runes were new, and the soldier and his armour and his sword had something still of the early magic about him, more potent than any inspirations of wizardry that had come later from his master's mind. Yet this knight, as Elveric soon was able to feel along his arm and his sword, had none of those 3 master runes of which the old witch had spoken when she made the sword on her hill. for these were preserved unuttered by the King of Elfland himself, and which to hedge his own presence. To have known of their existence, she must have flown by broom to Elfland and spoken secretly alone with the king. And the sword that had visited earth from so far away smote like the falling of thunderbolts, and green sparks rose from the armour, and crimson and sword met sword, and thick elvish blood moved slowly from wide slits down the cuirass, and Lirazel gazed in awe and wonder and love. And the combatants edged away, fighting into the forest, and branches fell on them, hacked off by their fight. And the runes in Alvric's far-travelled sword exulted and roared at the elf knight, until in the dark of the wood, amongst branches severed from disenchanted trees, with a blow like that of a thunderbolt riving an oak tree, Alvric slew him. At that crash, and at that silence, Lirazel ran to his side. "Quick," she said, "for my father has 3 runes." She durst not speak of them. "Whither?" said Alvric, and she said, "To the fields, you know." Chapter 4. Alvric comes back to earth after many years. Back through the guarding wood went Alvric and Lirazel, she only looking once more at those flowers and lawns, seen only by the furthest travelling fancies of poets in deepest sleep, then urging Alvric on. He chose the way past trees he had disenchanted, and she would not let him delay even to choose his path, but kept urging him away from the palace that is only told of in song. And the other trees began to come lumbering towards them from beyond the lustrous, unromantic line that Alvric's sword had smitten, looking queerly as they came at their stricken comrades, whose listless branches drooped without magic or mystery. And as the moving trees came nearer, Lirazel would hold up her hand, and they all halted and came no more. And still she urged upon Alvric to hasten. She knew her father would climb the brazen stairs of one of those silver spires. She knew he would soon come out onto the high balcony. She knew what rune he would chant. She heard the sound of his footsteps ascending, ringing now through the wood. They fled over the plain beyond the wood, all through the blue, everlasting elfin day, and again she looked over her shoulder and urged Alvric on. The Elf King's feet boomed slow on the 1,000 brazen steps, and she hoped to reach the barrier of twilight, which on that side was smoky and dull, when suddenly, as she looked for the 100th time at the distant balconies of the glittering spires, she saw a door begin to open high up, above the palace, only told of in song. She cried, "Alas!" to Alvric, but at that moment the scent of briar roses came drifting to them from the fields we know. Alvric knew not fatigue, for he was young, nor she, for she was ageless. They rushed forward, he taking her hand. The Elf King lifted his beard, and just as he began to intone a rune that only once may be uttered, against which nothing from our lands can avail, they were through the frontier of twilight, and the rune shook and troubled those lands in which Lirazel walked no longer. When Lirazel looked upon the fields we know, as strange to her as once they have been to us, their beauty delighted her. She laughed to see the haystacks and loved their quaintness. A lark was singing it, and Lirazel spoke to it, and the lark seemed not to understand, but she turned to other glories of our fields, for all were new to her, and forgot the lark. It was curiously no longer the season of bluebells, for all the foxgloves were blooming, and the many was gone, and the wild roses were there. Alvric never understood this. It was early morning, and the sun was shining, giving soft colours to our fields, and Lirazel rejoiced in those fields of ours at more common things than one might believe there were among the familiar sights of earth's every day. So glad was she, so gay, with her cries of surprise and her laughter, that there seemed thenceforth to Alvric a beauty that he had never dreamed of in buttercups, and a humour in carts that he had never thought of before. Each moment she found, with a cry of joyous discovery, some treasure of earth that he had not known to be fair. And then, as he watched her, bringing a beauty to our fields more delicate even than the wild roses brought, he saw that her crown of ice had melted away. And thus she came from the palace that may only be told of in song, over the fields of which I need not tell, for they were the familiar fields of earth, that the ages changed but little, and only for a while, and came at evening with Alveric to his home. All was changed in the castle of Earl. In the gateway they met a guardian whom Almeric knew. The man wondered to see them. In the hall and upon the stairs they met some that tended the castle, who turned their head in surprise. Alveric knew them also, but all were older, and he saw that quite 10 years must have passed away during that one blue day he had spent in Elfland. Who does not know that this is the way of Elfland? And yet who would not be surprised if they saw it happen as Alveric saw it now? He turned to Lirazel and told her how 10 or 12 years were gone, but it was though a humble man who had wed an earthly princess should tell her he had lost a sixpence. Time had no value or meaning to Lirazel, and she was untroubled to hear of the 10 lost years. She did not dream what time means to us here. They told Alveric that his father was long since dead, and one told him how he died happy without impatience, trusting to Alveric to accomplish his bidding, for he had known somewhat of the ways of Elfland, and knew that those that traffic twixt here and there must have something of that calm in which Elfland forever dreams. Up the valley, ringing late, they heard the blacksmith's work. The blacksmith was he who had been the spokesman of those who went once to the long red room to the Lord of Earl. And all these men yet lived, for time, though it moved over the vale of Earl, as over all fields we know, moved gently, not as in our cities. Thence Alveric and Lirazel went to the holy place of the Freer, and when they found him, Alveric asked the Freer to wed them with Christendom rites. And when Freer saw the beauty of Lirazel flash mid the common things in his little holy place, for he had ornamented the walls of his house with knickknacks that he sometimes bought at fairs, he feared at once she was of no mortal line. And when he asked her whence she came, and she happily answered, Elfland, the good man clasped his hands and told her earnestly how all in that land dwelt beyond salvation. But she smiled. For a while in Elfland she had always been idly happy, and now she only cared for Alveric. The Freer went then to his books to see what should be done. For a long while he read in silence but for his breathing, while Alveric and Lirazel stood before him. And at last he found in his book a form of service for the wedding of a mermaid that had forsaken the sea, though the good book told not of Elfland. And this, he said, would suffice, for that mermaids dwelt equally within the elf folk beyond thought of salvation. So he sent for his bell and such tapers that are necessary. Then turning to Lirazel, he bade her forsake and forswear, and solemnly to renounce all things pertaining to Elfland, reading slowly out of a book the words to be used on this wholesome occasion. Good Freer, Lirazel answered, naught said in these fields can cross the barrier of Elfland, and well that is so, for my father has 3 runes that could blast this book when he answers one of its spells. Were any word able to pass through the frontier of twilight, I will spell no spells with my father. But I cannot wed Christendom man, the Freer replied, with one of the stubborn who dwell beyond salvation. Then Alveric implored her, and she said the say in the book. Though my father could blast this spell, she added, if it ever crossed one of his runes. And, the bell being now bought and the tapers, the good man wedded them in his little house with the rites that are proper for the wedding of a mermaid that hath forsaken the sea. of Part 2. If you have been enjoying this audiobook, please take the time to subscribe. It would really help the station. If you could also like or leave a comment or share this station with other friends, that would be great. Thank you.